My boyfriend texted, "I'm moving in with my professor so I can focus on my studies. Don't be insecure." I replied, "Good luck with that." Then I forwarded his message to her husband, along with the apartment lease Ethan had asked me to co-sign. Within 48 hours, the plan he thought would launch his career had begun to collapse. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 27 when all of this happened, and until that Thursday afternoon, I believed trusting the person you loved was the hardest part of a relationship. I didn't realize the harder lesson would be learning to trust myself again. The message arrived during my lunch break while I sat alone in my car. "Hey babe, I've been thinking, and I've decided to stay with Dr. Vanessa Hale for a while. It'll help me focus on finishing my thesis. She has a guest house that's perfect for studying. Please don't be insecure about this. It's purely academic and a huge opportunity for my future. Love you." I read the text 4 times before admitting I wasn't misunderstanding it. My boyfriend really was moving in with his married professor, and somehow he'd already decided any objection from me would simply be insecurity. I quietly packed up my lunch. I'd completely lost my appetite. To understand why that message hit me so hard, you have to understand what the previous 6 months had done to our relationship. Ethan Cole was 25 and finishing his master's degree in psychology. When we first started dating, he was thoughtful, funny, and painfully unsure of himself. After every presentation, he'd call asking if he'd sounded foolish, and for 2 years I was the person reminding him he was far more capable than he believed. So when he began working under Dr. Vanessa Hale, I was genuinely excited for him. She was 48, widely respected on campus, and exactly the kind of mentor ambitious graduate students dreamed of working with. At first, everything sounded reasonable. A dinner because her office was busy, a late meeting because faculty schedules were impossible, then weekend conferences where everyone else somehow cancelled except the two of them. Each explanation worked on its own, but together they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. The first time I questioned their relationship, Ethan laughed it off. "Claire, she's old enough to be my mother." That doesn't answer my question. She's married. You're avoiding the question. He shook his head with an exasperated smile. I can't believe you actually think something inappropriate is happening. I never said that. You didn't have to. By the end of the conversation, I was the one apologizing. Somehow a simple question had been turned into proof that I was controlling instead of concerned. About a month later, it happened again. Ethan spent nearly 40 minutes choosing an outfit for what he called a quick meeting about his thesis. When he mentioned they were having dinner at a wine bar first, I asked why a discussion about chapter revisions couldn't happen on campus. "There it is," he said, grabbing his keys. "What?" "That look. You're already questioning me." I asked one question. "No, you questioned why." He walked out before I could answer, and somehow I was left feeling guilty all over again. I didn't come home until after midnight, carrying the faint scent of expensive floral perfume that definitely wasn't mine. "Someone hugged you?" I asked while hanging up his jacket. "Vanessa?" he replied without hesitation. We celebrated finishing my literature review. I watched my face carefully, almost waiting for another argument. "Aren't you going to say anything?" "What should I say?" After a brief silence, he visibly relaxed. It wasn't because I'd believed him, it was because I'd stopped challenging him. That was when something changed in me. Instead of arguing, I started paying attention. Ethan always turned his phone away whenever Vanessa texted, mentioned her more often than he mentioned me, found reasons to meet her at restaurants instead of on campus, and somehow dressed better for seeing her than he ever did for our own dates. Little by little, my instincts grew stronger while my confidence shrank. 3 days before that text, Ethan brought up renting an apartment near campus. "It's only temporary until I finish my thesis," he said, sliding the listing across the coffee table. The rent was $1,250 a month. When I pointed out how expensive it was, he admitted his credit wasn't good enough to qualify a loan and asked me to co-sign. "It doesn't mean you'll actually pay anything," he insisted. "It's just paperwork." It wasn't just paperwork. If Ethan walked away, the debt would become mine. "I need time to think." His expression immediately changed. "So you don't believe I'll make the payments?" I never said that. "You didn't have to." The conversation ended the same way the others had. He wrapped guilt around a perfectly reasonable financial decision until I was the one questioning myself. Later that night, he emailed the unsigned lease anyway, already expecting me to sign it. Sitting alone in my car, I reread Ethan's message until one detail finally stood out. 3 days earlier, he'd asked me to co-sign a lease for an apartment near campus. Now he claimed he was moving into his professor's guest house. Both stories couldn't be true. I reopened the lease, searched the property records, and within minutes found the answer. The address wasn't a student apartment at all. It was a 2-bedroom condominium owned jointly by Richard Hale and Dr. Vanessa Hale. The story fell into place all at once. Ethan wasn't renting an apartment near campus. He was moving into a condo owned by Vanessa and her husband, while asking me to carry the financial risk if everything went wrong. I wasn't angry yet. I was embarrassed I'd come so close to signing the lease. Just then, my phone buzzed. Okay. Don't overthink this. I couldn't help laughing. Every concern became insecurity. Every question sounded like jealousy. And before long, I had stopped trusting my own judgment instead of his explanations. I replied with 2 words. Good luck. Then I searched for Richard Hale. His professional profile listed a public work email, and after staring at a blank screen for nearly a minute, I finally started typing. Mr. Hale, I'm sorry to contact you this way, but I believe you deserve to see these documents. My boyfriend informed me today that he's moving into property connected to your wife while finishing his graduate program. 3 days ago, he asked me to co-sign the attached lease. After reviewing public property records, I discovered the condominium belongs to both of you. I've attached screenshots of his message and the lease agreement. I don't know every detail of what's happening between them, but I believe you deserve the truth. I attached everything that mattered, hit send, and blocked Ethan before I could talk myself out of it. The backlash started before I even left work. Ethan bombarded me from unfamiliar numbers, then switched to Instagram when I blocked those 2. Not once did he deny what I'd uncovered. He only wanted to know why I'd told Richard. By the time I drove home, I had a feeling this story was only beginning. I just didn't realize one overlooked document was about to destroy every lie they'd prepared. The next evening, an email from Richard finally appeared. The subject line read simply, "Thank you. Claire, thank you for bringing this to my attention. I appreciate your honesty, and I'm sorry you've been pulled into this situation. I don't have many answers yet, but I promise you I intend to find them. Richard Hale." His reply was short, calm, and completely free of blame. For the first time in weeks, I felt like someone else was finally seeing what I'd been seeing all along. I had no idea he'd already confronted Vanessa, or that she had walked out less than 10 minutes into the conversation. Ethan reacted very differently. Blocking his number only forced him to find new ways to reach me. His messages swung wildly between denial, anger, and desperation. You completely misunderstood. You had no business contacting Richard. Can we please just talk? You're destroying everything I've worked for. This doesn't have to end us. The last message almost made me laugh. Even now, he seemed convinced our relationship was the smallest problem. Around 8:30 that night, I heard a key slide into my front door. Before I could react, Ethan stepped inside carrying the backpack he'd left behind earlier that week. What did you do? I'm making dinner. I'm serious. So am I. He slammed the door shut. You emailed Richard. Yes. Do you have any idea what you've done? I told a husband that his wife and my boyfriend were planning a future behind his back. His expression tightened. That's not what this is. No, you've destroyed my thesis. I didn't realize your thesis depended on secretly moving into your professor's condo. For the first time since walking in, he looked genuinely shaken. How did you know about the condo? I read the lease. It wasn't supposed to. He stopped himself. It wasn't supposed to what? After a long pause, he quietly admitted, Vanessa owns an investment property. I know. It was only temporary. I know. It would have helped me focus. I shook my head. You've given me 3 different explanations in less than 2 minutes. It's complicated. No, Ethan. It's actually very simple. I picked up the printed lease from the counter and placed it between us. You told me this was a studio near campus. You forgot to mention it was a 2-bedroom condo owned by your professor and her husband. His silence answered the question before he ever spoke. I slid the lease across the counter. You asked me to co-sign this because your credit wasn't good enough. If you stopped paying, the landlord could come after me for every missed payment. I never would have let that happen, he said, rubbing both hands through his hair. I would have figured something out. You already had, I replied. You just forgot to tell me your professor owned the condo. The color drained from his face. I never expected everything to spiral like this. No, I said quietly. You expected me to trust you without asking the questions that would have exposed the truth. The fight disappeared from him almost instantly. He sank into a chair, staring at the floor before finally admitting why he'd let everything go so far. Vanessa believed in me. She said I was brilliant, that I could become one of the best researchers she'd ever supervised. Every time I was with her, I felt like I mattered. His words hurt more than I expected, because I couldn't stop thinking about the nights I'd spent helping him rehearse presentations, correcting endless drafts, or quietly covering groceries whenever his stipend ran short. I'd spent 2 years believing in him before Vanessa ever entered the picture. You really think I never saw your potential? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, he whispered, I don't know anymore. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached for one last excuse. Nothing physical happened. I simply waited. We kissed once. The sentence slipped out before he realized what he'd admitted. He covered his face with both hands while I walked over and switched off the stove. Dinner no longer mattered. You know what the saddest part is? I asked. If you'd just fallen in love with someone else, this would have broken my heart, but maybe we could have survived it. Instead, you built an escape plan. You were ready to move in with another woman while leaving me legally responsible if everything fell apart, and every time I questioned you, you convinced me I was insecure instead of listening to the obvious. His shoulders slumped. I know, I'm sorry. I don't need another apology, I said. I needed honesty months ago, before you turned my trust into your backup plan. I studied his face for a long moment before asking the question that had been sitting in my chest since this conversation began. Do you know what hurts the most? You never gave me the chance to make an informed choice. If you'd come home and admitted you were developing feelings for someone else, I would have been devastated, but at least I would have been deciding my future with the truth. Instead, you made decisions for both of us while keeping me in the dark. I broke down. I love you, Claire. I still love you. I shook my head. No, you loved what I did for you. I helped with your bills, corrected your papers, talked you through every setback, and when you needed someone to guarantee that lease, you assumed I'd do that too. The moment someone made you feel more important, you were willing to gamble everything I had. Hein took a hesitant step toward me, but I instinctively stepped back. I'm not afraid of you, I said before he could speak. I'm just finished. The words hit him harder than any argument. He closed his eyes for a moment, then asked quietly, So this is really over? It didn't end tonight, I replied. It ended with every lie you chose to tell. Neither of us moved for several seconds. Finally, I held out my hand. The key! He slowly reached into his pocket, stared at it for a moment, then placed it in my palm. I really did love you. I know, I said. I just wish you'd loved me enough to be honest. His eyes filled again. I hope someday you'll forgive me. I hope someday I stop wondering why I ever believed I wasn't enough. Without another word, he walked out. Just before the door closed, he turned back and muttered, You've ruined everything. I let the door shut without answering. The next morning, I called a locksmith, and before lunch, every lock in my apartment had been replaced. I thought changing the locks would finally give me some peace. Changing the locks ended Ethan's access to my apartment, but it did nothing to stop his family. That Sunday afternoon, someone knocked on my door. It wasn't Ethan. It was his mother. I'd always known Diane Cole as a warm, polite woman, which made the anger on her face even more startling. The moment I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me, she folded her arms and got straight to the point. You've destroyed Ethan. I'm sure that's what he told you, I replied. Did he also tell you about the lease? She frowned. What lease? That told me everything. Ethan had told his family just enough to make himself look like the victim, but he'd conveniently left out the part where he'd asked me to guarantee the condo he planned to move into with his married professor. I took a steady breath. 3 days before he told me he was moving in with Dr. Vanessa Hale, he asked me to co-sign the lease. He said it was only paperwork. It was paperwork that would have made me legally responsible for $1,850 a month if he stopped paying. Diane started to object, but I gently cut her off. You know how a lease works, don't you? She nodded cautiously. Then you also know why one missing detail changes everything. What detail? The condo belonged to Vanessa. Her expression froze. That's impossible. Without another word, I unlocked my phone and handed it to her. The property records, the lease, and Ethan's text message were already open. I read through each document in silence. By the time she looked back at me, the certainty she'd arrived with was gone. He told us it was university housing, she said quietly. It wasn't. He also said, never tried to hide anything. He hid it from me, I replied. If I hadn't checked the property records, I would have signed that lease believing it was an ordinary apartment near campus. Diane slowly handed my phone back, but she wasn't ready to let go of the argument. Ethan insists nothing physical happened. I know, I said. He told me the same thing. Then why involve Richard? Because whether they slept together wasn't the point. She frowned. I don't understand. I wasn't in a relationship with Richard, and I wasn't responsible for Vanessa's marriage. I was in a relationship with Ethan, and he expected me to guarantee the condo where he planned to live with another woman. That's the betrayal. Diane struggled to answer. Vanessa manipulated him. She probably did, I admitted. She was older. She had authority over his education, and she knew exactly how ambitious he was. But none of that forced Ethan to lie to me, hide who owned the condo, or ask me to risk my credit without telling me the truth. She lowered her eyes. Hai was vulnerable. Hai was also responsible for his own choices. Diane searched for another explanation, but neither of us could escape the same fact. Ethan had made those choices himself. After a long silence, Diane asked quietly, "What happens now?" "I honestly don't know," I admitted. Then I remembered Richard's email and looked back at her. "Actually, I think the university already knows." Her expression changed immediately. "What do you mean?" "I think Richard reported everything. Universities take relationships between professors and graduate students very seriously." Ethan never mentioned that. I'm not surprised. The confidence she'd arrived with was gone. She handed my phone back, thanked me so quietly I almost missed it, then walked to her car and drove away without another word. The next few days were unusually quiet. No angry messages, no surprise visits, no new social media accounts trying to contact me. I almost convinced myself everyone had finally accepted reality. Then Wednesday morning, an email arrived from Richard's assistant. "Mr. Hale would appreciate the opportunity to thank you personally. Would Thursday afternoon work for coffee?" I accepted the invitation. The following afternoon, I met Richard at a coffee shop halfway between my office and the hospital where he worked. He was already waiting for me, dressed in a grey suit that looked as tired as he did. He wasn't wearing a wedding ring. "Thank you for coming," he said after we sat down. Once our coffee arrived, he apologized for what Vanessa had done. I told him none of it was his fault, but he quietly admitted he'd ignored too many warning signs because every explanation had sounded reasonable until my email connected them into one undeniable story. Over the years, I'd heard bits and pieces that never seemed important on their own. A dinner here, a conference there, a student getting more attention than everyone else. Your email was the first thing that connected all of it into one story. He opened a leather folder and slid another copy of Ethan's lease across the table. At first, the lease looked identical to mine. Then Richard showed me a separate side agreement attached to Vanessa's copy. It waived Ethan's rent while leaving the original $1,250 obligation in the lease I had been asked to guarantee. If anyone questioned why a graduate student was living in her condo, Vanessa could produce a legitimate rental agreement. If the arrangement collapsed, my name would still be tied to the payments. I stared at the paperwork, realizing I'd never been asked to protect Ethan. I'd been asked to protect their story. Richard broke the silence. "I confronted Vanessa the same night you emailed me. She denied everything at first, then admitted Ethan was staying there, and somehow expected me to believe I was the one overreacting. I couldn't help smiling bitterly. That's exactly what Ethan used to say every time I questioned him." Richard gave a tired nod. "I figured you'd recognize the pattern." After a brief pause, he mentioned something I hadn't expected. "Ethan called me yesterday." "To apologize?" "I wish." Richard let out a quiet laugh. He insisted nothing inappropriate had happened, then asked if he could still stay in the condo as long as they kept things professional. Richard's expression never changed. Only then did I realize he wasn't joking. "After everything?" "He honestly believed the problem wasn't what they'd done," Richard said quietly. "Only that someone had found out." We spent another hour talking, not about the affair itself, but about how easy it is to doubt your own instincts when someone keeps handing you believable excuses. Unfortunately, he was right. The following Tuesday, another member of Ethan's family showed up at my apartment. The pounding on my door was loud enough to send my neighbor's dog into a frenzy. Through the peephole, I recognized Ethan's older brother, Mason. We'd only met a couple of times, and judging by the expression on his face, he hadn't come to hear my side of the story. I left the chain lock in place and cracked the door open. "What do you need?" "It's about Ethan." "Then I don't think we have anything to discuss." I started closing the door, but Mason caught it with one hand before immediately easing back. "Just give me 5 minutes." I looked from his hand to his face. "If we're going to talk, you step back first." He hesitated for a second, then lowered his hand and took a step away from the doorway. Only then did I walk into the hallway, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to change either of our minds. The moment I stepped into the hallway, Mason got straight to the point. "My brother wants his security deposit back." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. "What security deposit?" "The money Ethan paid to live here." I let out a short laugh before I could stop myself. Ethan never paid a security deposit because he never rented this apartment. He wasn't on the lease, he never contributed to the rent, and legally, he never lived here. His expression hardened. "That's not what he told us." "I'm sure it isn't." Instead of arguing, I unlocked my phone and handed it to him. My lease, rent portal, and payment history all showed the same thing. One tenant, one account, and years of payments made entirely by me. Ethan had spent plenty of nights here and occasionally picked up groceries, but none of that made him a tenant. Mason scrolled through the records in silence before lowering the phone. "He said he was covering half. The paperwork says otherwise." For the first time since he arrived, uncertainty replaced his confidence. It also explained something I'd been trying to understand for days. Ethan hadn't just lied to me, he'd rewritten our relationship for everyone around him until he genuinely looked like the generous boyfriend who'd been taken advantage of. I actually feel sorry for him, I admitted. That caught Mason off guard. When someone spends months rewriting reality, they eventually start believing their own version. He still loved you. Then why was he moving into another woman's condo while asking me to guarantee the lease? He searched for an answer but couldn't find one. Instead, he changed direction. He's lost everything. You could still help him. How? Tell the university you misunderstood. I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide whether he really believed what he'd just said. So you want me to lie for the man who lied to me for months? I'm asking you to save my brother. And I'm telling you he had every chance to save himself. Frustration finally got the better of him. He slammed his fist into the hallway wall, the bang echoing through the building hard enough to bring my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, to her door. She took one look at the dent in the drywall, then at Mason's clenched fist before turning to me. Are you all right? I'm fine. She nodded once without taking her eyes off him. If management asks, I saw exactly what happened. Mason muttered something under his breath and walked away without another word. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Mrs. Alvarez gave me a reassuring smile. Don't let anyone convince you this was your fault. Mason left, but the retaliation followed me to work the next morning. Just after I sat down at my desk, my manager stopped beside my cubicle and quietly asked if we could talk in his office. The seriousness in his voice was enough to make my stomach tighten before he'd said another word. As soon as the door closed, he got straight to the point. HR received an anonymous complaint about you. What kind of complaint? Whoever sent it claims you've been harassing a graduate student and deliberately interfering with his education. For a moment, I simply stared at him, waiting for the rest of the story. When nothing else came, I asked the only question that mattered. Did they include any evidence? He shook his head. Names? Documents? Specific incidents? Nothing. Just accusations. I opened my laptop. Then let me show you what actually happened. Over the next 20 minutes, I walked him through everything from Ethan's text message to the lease, the property records, and the email I'd sent Richard. He listened without interrupting until he'd seen every document for himself, then leaned back in his chair with a puzzled expression. So your boyfriend asked you to guarantee a lease without telling you his professor owned the property, and after discovering that, you informed her husband. That's exactly what happened. He glanced at the documents one last time before closing the folder. I don't see harassment, he said. I see someone documenting facts. If anything, this complaint looks like an attempt to intimidate you before anyone had a chance to ask questions. HR added my evidence to the case file, marked the complaint as unsupported, and assured me they would deal with any further contact the same way. Walking back to my desk, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. People who had never met Ethan or Vanessa reached the same conclusion in 20 minutes, that I'd spent months doubting because someone I loved kept telling me my instincts were wrong. I thought that would finally be the end of it. Instead, Saturday's mail brought another surprise. The envelope was handwritten. The return address belonged to David Cole, Ethan's father. His letter stretched across 6 pages and never once acknowledged what Ethan had actually done. It spoke about forgiveness, loyalty, standing beside the person you love, and ended with a request that I contact the university, say I'd acted out of jealousy, and tell investigators nothing inappropriate had ever happened between Ethan and Dr. Vanessa Hale. The final sentence stood out more than everything else. A good woman protects the man she loves instead of destroying him. I didn't tear the letter up. I slipped it into a document sleeve, wrote the date across the front, and filed it away with everything else. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was evidence. That evening, Richard called with the first real update since the investigation had begun. The university finished its preliminary review, he said. They found enough evidence to open a formal investigation. Vanessa has already been suspended from supervising graduate students, and Ethan has been removed from her supervision while they continue looking into the case. I thought that was the end of the news until his voice grew quieter. Claire, they're also reviewing complaints involving former students. What does that mean? It means the investigators don't think Ethan was the first. I stood by the apartment window, watching the city lights slowly appear across the skyline, and realized this story had grown far beyond the 2 people who'd betrayed me. 3 weeks later, Richard called while I was walking back from lunch. It's over, he said without any introduction. The investigation is finished. I stopped where I was. What happened? Vanessa resigned. The university gave her a choice: leave quietly or face formal termination. I leaned against the hallway wall outside my office as he explained what investigators had found. It wasn't just one poor decision, but a pattern of policy violations involving conflicts of interest, abuse of professional authority, and inappropriate relationships with graduate students. More importantly, they no longer believed Ethan had been the only student involved. That part didn't shock me as much as I expected. After everything I'd learned, it almost felt inevitable. Richard told me investigators had interviewed several former students who were reluctant to come forward but had provided enough information, along with emails, financial records, travel documents, and university correspondence, to establish a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. What about Ethan? I finally asked. He lost Vanessa as his advisor immediately, and her research funding disappeared with her. He's transferred to a smaller university about 2 hours away, but he'll have to rebuild a large part of his thesis under a new supervisor. I wasn't happy to hear it, but I couldn't honestly say I was sad either. Mostly, I felt exhausted. Before ending the call, Richard quietly added, "My lawyer filed for divorce yesterday." "I'm sorry. So am I," he replied. "But I don't regret knowing the truth." Neither did I. Life became noticeably quieter after that. The anonymous complaints stopped, Ethan disappeared from my inbox, and for the first time in months, I believed everything was finally over. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I ran into him at a grocery store. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, as though the past few weeks had aged him far more than they should have. I agreed to 5 minutes. We stood outside near the parking lot while traffic passed behind us. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times, he admitted with a tired smile. "Now I don't know where to start." "The truth would have been a good place." He nodded. "I was stupid. Vanessa made me feel like I was extraordinary, and I convinced myself she believed in me." "You thought she believed in your potential?" "I guess I was just convenient." There was no arrogance left in his voice, only embarrassment. "I've spent weeks thinking about everything I did," he continued. "The lies, the manipulation, the lease. I hate the person I became." "You didn't suddenly become someone else," I said. "You made a series of choices, and eventually those choices became the person standing in front of me." He lowered his head. "I never wanted to trap you." "No," I replied. "You wanted options. You wanted the security of knowing that if your plan with Vanessa fell apart, someone else would still be responsible." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. "Whatever else I did, my feelings for you were real," he finally whispered. He'd said the same thing in my apartment weeks earlier, but this time my answer was different. "I believe you," I said. "I think you loved me in the only way you knew how, but loving someone doesn't erase the lies you told, the way you made me doubt my own judgment, or the fact that you almost convinced me to sign paperwork that could have ruined my finances. Those things don't cancel each other out. They existed at the same time." He lowered his eyes. "I kept telling myself I'd explain everything." "When?" "I don't know." "When Vanessa left her husband?" A tired smile crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. "I honestly thought she would." I shook my head. "People in her position rarely leave everything behind. You weren't the future she was building, Ethan. You were the secret she thought she could keep." I didn't argue because deep down he already knew I was right. After another long silence, he asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I looked across the parking lot where a father was helping his daughter load groceries into the trunk of their car. She laughed when he dropped a loaf of bread, completely unaware that only a few yards away, two people were saying goodbye to a future they'd once planned together. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "But I do know this. One day you'll stop being the first thing I think about when I wake up. It won't happen because I finally understand why you hurt me. It'll happen because your choices won't have any place in my life anymore." He nodded slowly. "I deserve that." Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and held out the small silver lighthouse keychain I'd given him during our first vacation together. "I thought you might want this back." I looked at it for a second before gently pushing his hand away. "No, keep it." "Why?" "So you remember how relationships actually end. Not with one mistake, but with months of small decisions that slowly destroy trust until there's nothing left worth saving." He closed his fingers around the keychain. "I hope you're happy." "I'm getting there," I said with a faint smile. "That's enough for now." I walked to my car without looking back. When I heard him quietly say my name one last time, I kept walking because some conversations don't end when the words run out. They end the moment you stop needing another answer. I honestly believed that would be the last time I'd ever see Ethan. Several months passed before I realized I was wrong. "My divorce is final," he said. "I'm sorry." "So am I," he replied. "But I wanted you to know something." I explained that after the university investigation ended, the divorce proceedings allowed his attorney to obtain additional emails Vanessa had never turned over during the investigation. There were hundreds of messages, but one conversation stood out because it explained almost everything. My stomach tightened. "I don't think I want to read them." "I didn't either," Richard admitted. But after I did, I finally understood how long this had really been happening. Richard and I met for coffee that afternoon. He still looked tired, but the constant tension I'd seen during our first meeting had finally eased. After we sat down, he placed a folder on the table and slid a single printed email toward me. "I'm not showing you everything," he said, "but I think you deserve to see this. The email had been sent by Vanessa nearly 4 months before Ethan ever asked me to co-sign the lease. One sentence stopped me cold. Claire will co-sign if Ethan handles her carefully. She trusts him enough not to question the ownership. My throat tightened as I kept reading. If she refuses, we'll find another explanation. A few lines later came the sentence that erased every doubt I'd carried for months. She doesn't need to know the ownership details yet. I slowly lowered the page. They hadn't simply lied to me in the moment. They'd planned the deception months in advance, assuming I'd trust Ethan enough not to ask questions until it was too late. Richard quietly closed the folder. I'm sorry you got pulled into all of this. You don't owe me an apology. I still wish none of this had ever touched your life. So do I. Before we left, he said something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I used to think trust meant believing someone no matter what. Now I think it also means believing yourself when something feels wrong. That lesson changed more than my relationship with Ethan. Over the following months, therapy helped me understand why I'd spent so much time apologizing for perfectly reasonable questions and accepting explanations that never truly answered them. Little by little, I stopped treating my instincts like an enemy and realized healthy relationships aren't built on constant self-doubt. Work improved too. About a month later, my manager called me into his office again, but this time it wasn't because of another complaint. He handed me a promotion to senior accounting analyst, along with a raise and a brighter office overlooking the parking lot. Walking back to my desk, I realized something had quietly changed. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for my phone to ruin my day. I never asked about Ethan again, but news still found its way to me. He transferred to a smaller graduate program, lost his funding, moved back in with his parents, and blamed everything on the email I'd sent. Whenever someone repeated that story, my answer never changed. One email didn't ruin his life. It simply exposed the choices he'd already made. Richard and I stayed in touch from time to time, not because there was anything romantic between us, but because we understood the same kind of betrayal. Eventually, he sold the condo Ethan had planned to move into. I couldn't look at it anymore, he admitted one afternoon. I understand, I replied. And I really did. Almost a year later, I heard Vanessa had accepted a teaching job at a small college several states away. According to Richard, she blamed everyone except herself. That didn't surprise me. One rainy Sunday, I found an old folder on my laptop labeled Ethan. It held screenshots, emails, the lease, and every message I'd once convinced myself I needed to keep. Looking at those files, I realized they weren't protecting me anymore. They were only keeping me tied to a story that had already ended. I selected the entire folder, paused for a second when I saw his old message telling me not to be insecure, then smiled and pressed delete. People still ask whether I regret sending Richard that email. I don't, because I neither created the lies nor asked anyone to risk their future for me. I simply refused to protect a deception that wasn't mine. All I did was refuse to become part of someone else's deception. One Saturday morning, I stood in my kitchen with a cup of coffee while sunlight filled the room. Nothing extraordinary had happened. My phone was silent, the apartment was quiet, and for the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for another explanation or another apology. That's when I realized healing had already arrived, not because I got revenge, but because Ethan's choices no longer controlled my peace.